Okay, the second chapter of this book is on humans, nature, and the quest for climate justice. I think everybody may have some sense of what climate justice means, but nonetheless, you need to have a formal definition so that it can be legally implemented. Unless you have a legal framework, you cannot really pursue justice. That's kind of the basic concept we have to start with. Here is a nice quote from the current Pope, Pope Francis, who released his encyclical, I think, in 2016, which was focused on climate. Why do we care what the Pope says? Well, actually, religious leaders and revered figures tend to have very broad influence. So their words really matter, and as people who are interested in reducing our impact on climate, we have to take whatever partnerships we can when it's useful for achieving the goal. Well, of course, within limits. Nonetheless, we'll see some of these potential partnerships. He said we are faced with not with two separate crises, one environmental and the other social, but rather with one complex crisis which is both social and environmental. Strategies for a solution demand an integrated approach to combating poverty, restoring dignity to the excluded, and at the same time protecting nature. This is really important because you cannot separate anymore livelihoods, energy consumptions, the patterns of them especially, and their ecological and environmental footprint. So if you want to save the environment, you have to offer livelihoods, employment as well. As we saw very clearly during COVID and some of the elections that happened, that people got tired of the pandemic, not only because of the restrictions, but also because the lockdowns and so on hammered the economy so hard that people's focus went back to economy and not so much the pandemic, and forget about climate change. There are groups which still talked about climate change, the role of climate change in the pandemic, COVID-19 we are in the middle of, and so on. But the poor people have to just worry about their next meal, and in this case even many of the not so poor people got into trouble in terms of jobs and income loss and so on. Okay, so defining climate justice and injustice. Here is one definition from excuse me, Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett. Rising levels of social inequality contribute to heightened competitive consumption among a given society's citizens. Okay, this rising consumption in turn causes an increase in industrial activity that contributes to climate change, in particular to environmental harm in general. This is not exactly climate justice, but this talks about where the society's unintended consequences come from that actually end up harming the environment, even though that's not what we set out to do. Christina Erges and Richard York argue that the carbon emissions are lower in nations where women have high political status. New Zealand, for example, Germany, and so on. Greta Gard, another social scientist, argues militaristic policy making is linked to ecological harm. The military-industrial complex requires enormous amounts of energy, space, and so on, and they are generally not as scrutinized as private industries when they occupy space and start exploiting resources, because militaries tend to have special powers to take what they want. So where does climate justice or climate injustice start from? If you look at the distribution of populations by income, you look at the top 10%, richest 10%, and then the poorest 50%. And look at the emissions. 49% of the emissions, percentage of emissions by the world population, they are responsible because of their total lifestyle consumptions. Okay, this is very critical. And then it drops 19, 11, 7, and so on. And the bottom 50% of the population is responsible for only about 10% of the total lifestyle consumption emissions. Okay, not total emissions, but total lifestyle consumption emissions. Slight difference between the total and lifestyle consumptions, because it includes things like travel and air conditioning, refrigeration, phones, computers, etc. Nonetheless, top 10% is consuming, emitting 50%, almost 49% of the total emissions. And this is important to look at even within a country. Okay, so if you look at US, which is rich, and average per capita footprint is something like 16 tons per person per year, but there also top 10% emit 50%, and then bottom 50%, bottom 40, and the average, and so on. Okay, so within a rich country, you still have people who are dispossessed, suffering injustice, climate injustice. This comes in terms of heat waves, disease morbidity, mortality, and so on. Okay, that's the same, of course, in all other countries like Canada, Great Britain, Deutschland, Italy, China, of course, India. But you can see that even the richest here are consuming much less than what's consumed in rich countries, but this is growing very rapidly. So as India and China get richer, the richest 10%, even in these countries, are increasing their lifestyle consumption by so much that they will soon be in the same as the Western world, the rich countries. Okay, so then averaging over a country like India or China wouldn't make much sense, because you have very poor people and very rich people. There is a very valuable definition based on this called the Global South. Okay, so the red colors here, you can see that you can basically draw a line across here, and except for Australia, everybody is to the south of that line. So that's why it's called the Global South. Developing countries, poor countries, highly vulnerable countries to climate change. So what are the typical things happening? AI, this is just focused on AI. This is from a paper that just looked at the Global South and the uptake of artificial intelligence. Why is that important? Because this is now all the new rage, that AI, deep learning, and machine learning will help solve many of the world's problems. Okay, in that name, lots of data is collected, not only openly, but implicitly by through your phone, through your travel patterns, through your Google searches, and so on, right? So AI growth for citizen services is promising in the region over here, which is good. Technological uptake in Africa is slower. Africa is still the most disproportionately impacted by climate change, and it remains far behind in many ways. There are stark differences in AI uptake in developed and developing Asia. So some parts of China are developing fast, but Japan, Korea, South Korea, and Australia obviously are taking up AI and making rapid progress. Parts of India and China also serve in developing tools for the rest of the world in terms of outsourced AI work. So this is kind of a setup for what climate justice and climate injustice mean, and how they interact with the human nature of profit making, belief in capitalism as the best way for innovation and making money. can that be done without harming the environment and without creating unequal distribution of wealth? That's the big question.